My people, we're ready to mount up like an eagle. Stand and fight against evil. A system rigged and deceitful.
Welcome to the King Talks podcast, where we're all about truth, community, and discussing the things you care about because we care about you. Of course, I'm your host, Adam Coleman. Now, for anybody who's been riding along with us, locked in with the King Talks podcast, I'm sure you enjoyed the episode that we had with David Banner, where we get into hip-hop and matters of spirituality, as well as the state of the black community. Now, we got a lot of feedback from that interview. David Banner obviously had lots to say, particularly in regard to critiques of religion and specifically Christianity. At the beginning of the Banner episode, I mentioned that the King Talks podcast is all about broadening the conversation about what's on people's minds, what's going on in our communities, and how these things can be approached from a biblical perspective. With that in mind, we do invite our guests to speak on things that they're passionate about, even when some of their viewpoints are maybe controversial or don't align with what the King movement stands by. In this case, we believe that our guest, David Banner, gave voice to some concerns and questions that are gaining traction among some in the black community, and therefore warranted a more direct response than what we would normally provide during a more conversational sort of interview. So in this session of Table Talks, we'll be taking a listen to the outtakes from the David Banner interview as Cliff Means and yours truly provide well-evidenced responses to the claims David Banner made concerning the church and Christianity. Get your popcorn ready. This episode is about to be lit.
My people, we're ready to mount up like an eagle. Stand and fight against evil. A system rigged and deceitful. King, you can hear it when I rhyme. I'm a king, renewed in my mind. I'm a king, I got a different bloodline. I'm a king, jump, I am a king. I'm a king.
And we back at it again, man, with another Table Talks. Appreciate you guys riding with us. Want to definitely welcome to the show my man Cliff Means, back at it again. What's going on there, brother?
Hey, what up, though? You know, special shout out Detroit style. What up, though? Because I'm at home in Detroit for the holidays, chilling with the family.
Gotcha.
Normally residing in Queens, New York, and right on time. We whooped on the Knicks tonight, so we got that win here at the Palace. Yep, put in that work, and you know we looking good, man. Everything is good in the D.
So here's the thing, man. This week we're talking about the David Banner interview that we had in our last episode. It was a great interview, man. I really enjoyed that interview. It was interesting getting his perspective, and but I kind of wanted to, I wanted the listeners to kind of hear your point of view in terms of, why we brought him in, what was our approach to that interview, and kind of give us just a little bit of a, behind the scenes perspective, man. A lot of people had questions about that interview. There were a lot of questions.
Yeah, I
got
mean,
a lot of feedback.
I had friends hitting me up like, "Yo, y'all really chopped that podcast up." I heard the DJ scratches, in mid sentence, and it sounded like y'all really chopped it up. And yeah, we did not play the interview in its full context, and there were multiple reasons for that. We didn't chop it all out. A lot of people heard a lot of things that David Banner said that were knowing that the King podcast. We are a Christian podcast. We do carry a Christian worldview, but not all our guests are Christian. Neither do we, and we're very intentional about that. We aim to engage a large, diverse audience on issues pertaining to faith, race, culture, and things that we feel will ultimately, in the end, empower people, but especially people who are in the African American community. And so we felt like looking at David Banner's life and what he's done in music, particularly, and the role that he's played in hip hop music, given that, he came up on a song like a Pimp, which personified misogyny.
Sure.
And we realize and recognize that a lot of the stereotypes and forms of hip hop that are put forward the most have a detrimental impact to some extent on African American culture. And so when you have somebody like David Banner who goes from like a pimp to marry me, and Magnolia and conscious hip hop, and has become a real loud voice in the culture for reform in the music. We felt he would be somebody that would be an awesome guest on the show. We were aware of his views on Christianity, and we were hoping that the interview didn't necessarily go in that route, but we were ready for that. You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
so we invite that. We invite critical thought. We're not afraid of folks coming on here and saying something about Christianity. We're not censoring anyone. That's not what we're about. We're about, putting it all out there and having a rational, civil conversation. But at the same time, he said so much that and one of the things is we want to give our guests the opportunity to express themselves. We don't want to dominate, and we don't want to get it bogged down into debates. But he said so much that you had no choice but to sort of go down that road of engaging him in a civil debate.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thought process was we chopped it up because there was some things that you kind of let slide. And so in an effort to kind of keep the conversation going. And, we didn't want to give off the impression that we just was cool with what he was saying particularly in regard to Christianity.
Right.
And we don't censor our guests. We're not paternalistic with our guests. Like, oh, you can't do that. You can't say that. But there are lines, there are boundaries, there are barriers, and there are certain things that we don't want to validate or come across, at least like we're endorsing. And so Chris, our founder and president, shout out to Chris,
Shout out.
who can't be with us because he's doing Undisputed this week, and then next week he's doing First Things First full show. So he couldn't be with us as a result of his schedule with that. But he felt it was important that King did not come across in our effort to have an open discussion that people wouldn't be able to use that to say we endorse certain kinds of views. So that's how we got to that
Mm-hmm.
conclusion. And I thought it turned out to be, man, by far one of our best podcasts, one of our best interviews. People were really, really encouraged. David Banner himself, I think, was really just blessed by the way you conducted yourself, handled yourself. He even said in the interview that he just appreciated that you gave him a space to put his view out there, whether you agree with it or not. And I think that's important. People need to see
Yeah.
that from Christians, because people have the perception that the moment you speak up or you speak out or disagree with a Christian, that a Christian is so insecure in their faith that they just freak out.
Right.
They
Right.
jump to censorship right away. They will, oh no, they all in their feelings because they're not very confident in what they believe. And so it's important that people can hear confident, secure people of faith engaging with those in the mainstream culture in a civil way, and people really responded with high marks because of that, and I enjoyed it as a result, because I think in the end you won a friend in David Banner, and
Sure.
and that's what it's all about. It's about winning people. It's about winning friends. It's not about winning arguments, and I think you did that, and I was really proud of you, man.
Dope, man. I appreciate that, bro. I appreciate it. From my end of the conversation, I totally agree with everything you just said. I think that, it's so important as Christians that we know why we believe what we believe. Now, of course, anybody that knows me and what I'm about, I have the True ID podcast in addition to what I'm doing here with King. And, where I deal with what's called Christian apologetics, basically defending the faith, answering objections to Christianity and, questions and concerns that people might have concerning Christianity. And one thing I always really harp on is that when why you believe what you believe, then you can enter into conversations, with a David Banner or somebody of that sort and, not be intimidated. You don't have to be intimidated because, you've taken the time to ground yourself in, why you hold to the Christian worldview, and you're able to articulate, what it is that you hold to as well in a way that other people can understand and hopefully receive it. And so I think that, from our end of the table, it is beneficial also for a person like David Banner to be able to sit down with a Christian who has spent time really understanding their own worldview. Because I think it probably, well, not probably, I mean, if you listen to what he said towards the end of the interview, I think he was, pleasantly surprised that, I was able to engage with him on some, difficult questions and wrestle through some things. And I think, honestly, that's what, more people want. They want to be able to engage with Christians on a variety of issues and feel like they're kind of getting something back. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I believe that the Christian worldview is robust enough, and well grounded enough to be able to engage in these real discussions and have something to say about it. Yeah. So it was a very interesting interview.
I'm proud of you, bro. I'm proud of you,
I'm
man.
Yeah, man. Yeah. And, to his defense, man, I will say, I mean, he did, throw some haymakers in that interview. But he was very cordial. He wasn't disrespectful. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
He was saying what he felt like he wanted to say. You know what I'm saying? And
that God box though, cats can't sleep on it.
Hey,
I mean,
man.
I ain't saying I stand, with everything that's on there. You know what I mean? But the joint is
artistically,
tough.
the joint is tough, man. Artistically, is very tough. And I think that as an artist, I think that he's put out a project that anybody would be proud of. And I think that for me, everybody knows I love hip hop. Everybody knows I'm a hip hop fan. And I'm always looking for ways to, bridge the gap, between folks and find a common ground. And I thought that was one thing that was cool about the interview with Banner, in that we were able to do that at certain points, find some common ground. So where we weren't just at each other's throats the whole time. But it's funny. People know how I get down, man. Like anybody that follows me on Facebook, they know how I get down as far as debates and stuff. Like I don't play around, I was trying to be.
Man, I give you credit. You kept trying to nudge it in where we wanted to go. We wanted to get into the juicy, sort of common, mainstream, contemporary discussions, no, and he just kept coming back to, if it wasn't the Trinity, it was white folks. And so kind of the segue into that, like what we're going to do today, because we didn't give our listeners the full interview, we're actually going to play the excerpts of what we cut out of the interview and then give you the opportunity, Adam, and I'll chime in here or there, but this will be really your opportunity to respond directly to some of the objections or points that he presented, and give kind of give your side of the debate that you kind of held back a little bit for the purpose of the interview. And so I want to start out with one of the first things that he got into at the beginning of the interview was the relationship between self-hatred in the Black community and the fact that we do not have spiritual continuity, meaning that because of European colonization and the way that Christianity, according to him, the way that Christianity was given to or forced onto Black people in America, we don't have our own spiritual identity. And unlike other cultures whose gods look like them, he referenced Asians who he says originally Buddha was a Black man, but Asians turned him into an Asian-like figure. And so he said, basically, if other cultures worship gods that look like them, except Black people, then how could we be expected to love ourselves when we've been given this white Jesus by white folks who lie to us? And how could we trust white people to give us something that's going to actually empower us? And so we'll play the excerpts so you can hear him in full. And then let me get your thoughts on the other side of that.
Most Black people don't know why they hate themselves. They don't know why they're malfunctioning. This is brother. When we were when we were released from slavery, we didn't have any mental, physical, social, or religious therapy. Think about this, and we're scared to admit this because most Black people are Christians. Most of the stories that we believe in as it pertains to God are no different than Santa Claus. They're lies. They're bald-faced lies. And think about it. White people have always lied about everything that they have given us. If they won't give us the key to this earth, why would they give us the correct key to heaven? So black people, think about it. If they're so religious and they love God so much, but they don't think God looks like them, then it's not hard for them to kill themselves. They don't even think God looks like them. When every other race of people, Buddha's original picture looked like Biggie Smalls. But even the Asian people said, you're going to have to tighten them eyes up, Jack.
Boy, Banner went in. So let me
to say the least, right?
Yeah, he said them folks lied. So okay, white folks lied. They gave us Jesus. You know, talk to us about that.
Cool, man. Yeah, he was definitely going in on that part, man. He was about to throw some bombs. Well, so here's the thing, man. When it comes to, you know, grappling with these types of objections, the first thing I want to do, I want to acknowledge kind of the place where it comes from. You know what I'm saying? Like from a historical perspective, you know, given that black history, so to speak, has been suppressed for so long. You talk about the miseducation of black folks. I mean, let's be real, man. Like coming up in school, for the most part, everything that we learned about, you know, quote unquote, black history revolved around either slavery or being oppressed, you know what I mean, in relation to the civil rights movement. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, given that sort of thing, I understand why, you know, this, you know, mistrust, you know, for the powers that be can develop, and this kind of, you know, white people lie sentiment, you know, kind of flows out of that. I understand that. But the problem is, you know, at some point we've got to move from emotion, you know what I'm saying, and kind of those sorts of things to really breaking things down logically and looking at the facts as they really are. Now, you know, when I'm dealing with somebody, you know, on more of a debate tip, you know, the way I look at it is every objection or every argument that somebody raises is kind of like a house. You know what I'm saying? And what I want to do is I want to find the foundation and then see if that foundation can stand up to scrutiny. And what you find is in this case, you know, he throws this premise out there, well, white people lie. You know what I'm saying? And therefore we shouldn't rock with Christianity. If that's your premise, that white people lie, therefore we shouldn't rock with Christianity, then the problem is that sort of objection is what you call a self-refuting statement. You know what I'm saying? Or a self-refuting objection. You know what I'm saying? It shoots itself in the foot, in other words. Now, what I mean by that is, you know, in any area of study, you know what I'm saying, if you want to have a well-rounded perspective, you're going to have to engage information that comes from white folks. I don't care what area of study it is. If you're talking about Egyptology, if you're talking about studying Africa, whatever it may be, you know, the vast majority of these people who are, you know, talking about Egypt, so on and so forth, they're quoting books that are written by white authors, right? Or even if you have, like, so for example, he mentioned Browder in the interview as well. Even if you have a black author, well, if you go to the bibliography, you know what I'm saying, that bibliography is going to have a list of names of the archaeologists and maybe primary sources that were discovered by so-and-so. And, you know, these sources that this black author has drawn from, many of them are going to be white folks too. And, you know, the archaeologist that was at such and such a dig and discovered that papyri that you want to quote all day, every day, you know, that person might have been white. So my whole point is, if your central premise is that, well, white people lie, and therefore we shouldn't rock with Christianity, then if you're going to be logically consistent, you got to apply that to everything else. In which case, you're going to undermine your own worldview and your own perspective in the process. You know that sword cuts both ways, and so that's number one. You know, and you know the other side of that is this, man. And I try to be, I try to be diplomatic, you know, when it comes to these kind of things. But when somebody hits me with the white man's religion thing, then what they're telling me is they haven't invested enough time in studying for themselves and really looking at the facts to get beyond the Eurocentric lens of church history. Okay. You actually have to assume a Eurocentric lens of church history in order to really view Christianity as the white man's religion. In other words, let me give you an example, right? Think about the fact that Christianity has been practiced in Africa for 2,000 years at this point, about 2,000 years, right? With 1,500 years of that coming prior to the transatlantic slave trade, right? Historically, I'm not talking about faith now. I'm just talking history. Okay, let's talk some history. When it comes to, within, let's say, Jesus was, crucified and so forth in either 30 or 33 A.D. Right? Within decades of the crucifixion, we already have evidence of Christianity cropping up in places like Egypt and North Africa. As a matter of fact, cats can Google it, man. There's archaeologically speaking, there's this is evidence in that we have the Hadramawt gravesite, okay, which is this huge gravesite. It's called the Hadramawt gravesite in North Africa. And what they found is Christian motifs like the Jesus fish and cross and so on and so forth. They found these Christian motifs in this North African gravesite in Hadramawt. But that gravesite, they've dated it back to at least, the end of the 1st century AD, right? So Christianity is nowhere near new to the African continent. It wasn't new to, quote, black people. I'm saying it certainly wasn't introduced to, quote, black people, for the first time when it comes to slavery. Now, moving forward from that, I mean, you have Christianity spread into, Ethiopia, but, by the 4th century or so. Ancient Nubia, which is modern day Sudan, was declared a Christian nation in about 450 AD. And was a Christian nation all the way up to about 1400 AD. So we're talking about a near millennium, all right, in ancient Sudan of Christian history, right? Now, with that being said, we could throw out other places. Ancient Morocco, was Christianized, Algeria, so on and so forth. And Africans weren't just, bystanders just receiving the gospel. Let me make that clear, okay? This wasn't the case of white folks going in and just preaching the gospel everywhere in Africa. What you have is Africans, played a pivotal role in the development, of the church and also even theology, right? Think about this. The Bible that you hold in your hands right now, okay? The reason why, or one of the reasons why we have the 27 books that we have in our Bible today is because during the conversation about canonicity, which books of the Bible were going to be included and so forth, you have 3 African councils, all right, held in North Africa that really set the tone for much of that conversation in regard to canonicity. Central concepts like the concept of the Trinity. The concept of the Trinity is pivotal, when it comes to, one of those distinctives of Christianity. Well, that word, Trinity, you trace that back to an African theologian, North African theologian named Tertullian. Right, he was the first one to really coin that phrase. We could talk about Augustine, Saint Augustine from North Africa, who, if there is a thinker who was more impactful in the Western world than Saint Augustine, I don't know who he is. That was a North African. You see what I'm saying? There's all these names. I could throw out Origen, Cyprian. We could talk about Athanasius. We could talk about Moses the Black. We could talk about Abba Anthony, Perpetua and Felicitas. We could just throw out name after name of Africans who played a pivotal role in the development of the church, long before the transatlantic slave trade. And here's the thing. Here's the thing. I'm gonna throw this at you.
Talk, brother. Is that what he told you?
Yeah, that's what he told me. And I told him I had some bars. I was pulling punches, but it's all good though. I really want to drive this home seriously because here's the thing, right? Yeah. When you think about the nations that enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, right? The 5 major players that you have is England, you have the Danish, Spanish, Portugal, and you also have France. Those are the 5 major nations that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the oldest of those nations, generally speaking, is going to be is probably England, which traces back to about the 5th century, okay, in terms of having any resemblance to England today, right? Now, what that means is Christianity had already been practiced for almost 5 centuries before these nations that enslaved us even existed in any sense that resembles what they are today. Just really chew on that. That's what I'm saying. So when people hit me with like, oh, what about white Jesus or, the white man did this in slavery? Listen, I'm sorry. I'm in it, I'm not trying to hype myself up, but, I really like to get to the bottom of things. I like to approach things from a logical perspective. And for me, it's completely illogical, given the 2,000 years of African history, to condense my stance, toward Christianity down to just a picture of white Jesus or one era of history. I'm saying for me, it makes more logical sense to look at the broad spectrum, okay, and then assess Christianity for what it is when properly applied, and then look at the big picture of Christian history. So, that's kind of how I came with that, man. What you was saying?
Well, you said it right, when properly applied, and I think, it's there's always, in every lie, there's got to be some truth if it's gonna go anywhere. And I think it's important, and I like how you started it out as saying, listen, like, let's start with history, and let's at the very least acknowledge, and particularly when a lot of people say the white man's religion, they're really speaking out of a certain legacy of pain, more say
Sure.
than anything else. I mean, because look, I don't care if it was white, blue, or whose religion it is. If it's right, that's my concern.
Mm-hmm.
But when they say white man's religion, they specifically talking about the way that it was handed to African Americans specifically. I wouldn't say handed to, but our interactions with Christianity. And I think I like to talk a little bit about that because I think, you know, because if we're talking about the African American experience specifically, we're talking about slaves coming to America, to the New World, from places in Africa below the Sahara, not necessarily Northern Africa or even countries below the Sahara like Ethiopia. They're coming from the west coast of Africa, below the Sahara, from places like Senegal, Sierra Leone, and with the exception of the Congolese, these Africans they've not been exposed to Christianity. The ones that are coming from the East Coast below the Sahara, they're coming from places like Mozambique and Zanzibar and Madagascar. So they also have not been exposed to Christianity. Their first interactions, they come from traditional African religions. Their first interactions with Christianity, those specific Africans, is from Europeans and through Europeans. And so that by itself is not a problem to me. Like, I have no problem with that. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that concept does not bother me whatsoever. What I think what does bother me, and what I do think bothers a lot of people like a David Banner, where this can be a stumbling block for him. Not to say it's
Mm-hmm.
right, but it
Sure.
can be a stumbling block for him when you had plantation missionaries that came to America to preach the gospel, and face resistance from plantation masters who didn't want their slaves to get Christianity, because Christianity was largely associated with the concepts of being an Englishman and being free, right?
Yeah.
That's what it meant to be Christian. To be Christian was to be free. And so there was a large resistance against allowing the slaves to even be exposed to Christianity. And people don't even talk about that part.
No, they don't.
People
Right.
like Banner, and I don't even know if they're aware of that part, the kind of resistance that missionaries initially came up against. But what does anger me as I study it and see it is I look at the compromises that missionaries made and how they
Sure.
began to work with the slave masters to come up with this kind of Christianity that was now racially based, right? That was based on whiteness and differentiating between what it meant to be a white Christian and what it meant to be a black Christian. And so now this lane was created that made it okay to be a Christian, black, and bound. You know what I'm saying? And then
Right.
and convincing the slave masters that, hey, if you allow us to bring this Christianity to them, it will make them more obedient to you, it will make them serve you better, we can then produce this sort of plantation based industrialized form of Protestantism where you have all these subservient blacks serving you
Mm-hmm.
with no rebellious issues. And then you fast forward to today when you have a lot of Christians, both black and white, but you have a lot of Christians who are okay with the kind of personal salvations that leads to an anti, a black person is, as they would say, acting a fool and then getting on the straight and narrow. They're okay with that kind of conversion, but conversion that leads to a black man waking up and now speaking out, they're not okay with that kind of conversion. And so there seems to be this kind of, uh, you know, sort of relationship where it's kind of falling from the same tree a little bit, where there is this sort of slave mentality or plantation missionary mentality that even is given, it's put out in the Black community today as it pertains to Christianity. And I think there's an association in the mind of people like Banner that says, wait, this feels kind of like it's being delivered to me in a way that wants to get me to be just hush up and be quiet. And so I think there's the past, there's also the present. But what I would say to somebody like Banner is, you one, discount what I said before, which is they met resistance for a reason because they knew what Christianity in its essence truly meant. And then you also discount what Christianity did once Black folks actually got a hold of it. Once they got a hold of it, what they did with it and how they then flipped it and read it and found what was actually in it. And it was the reason that you're probably even on this podcast. You know what I'm saying? It's one of the main reasons you're even talking to us right now is that Black folks got a hold of that word and they begin to read about the story of Moses and they begin to read about the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. Right.
All right, brother. All right.
Talk, brother.
Talk, brother.
But they began to read, right? And that led to much of what we now know, through abolition and civil rights and many of the movements that have led to a more free society in America. So, again, I can identify with the pain that's being voiced by David Banner in that instance. And I will acknowledge that. Too. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me throw this at you. I want to say a couple of things about that. I completely agree with you. First of all, let's talk a little scripture. So, Jesus said, he talks about, what happens if salt loses its savor, right? We're supposed to be the salt of the earth, but what happens when salt loses its savor? It's not worth anything. It's meant to be thrown out, right? Now, when you look at that scripture, you do a little bit of research on it, and you understand like what salt was that back then. He was talking about back then. They were talking about like an organic type salt, not the kind of stuff that we typically use today. It was more organic, and it could actually spoil, just like like a piece of bad fruit. I'm saying, and that's kind of the type of salt that he was referring to. Now, what's interesting is when you look it up, that salt, once it's spoiled, it actually became in a sense poisonous to the ground. As a matter of fact, in the Middle Ages, as a punishment, like say if you were a thief or something like that and you got caught, one of the punishments that they had back in the day is that they would do something called salting the ground. They would take spoiled salt and they would put it over your areas where you would normally grow crops so that you couldn't grow crops because that contaminated or that spoiled salt, you see what I'm saying, became, like I said, poisonous to the ground, right? Now, here's what I'm using as an illustration. When the church is supposed to be the salt of the earth and we don't stand in the role that we're supposed to be, and we lose our savor, we become poisonous. You see what I'm saying? That's what you see, when you're dealing with the transatlantic slave trade and so on and so forth. The church did not unify under the truth of God and stand resolutely against this assault on personhood on the behalf of Africans, Native Americans, and, just people of color in general. And when the church is on the wrong side of those types of things, then it becomes poisonous. So somebody like a David Banner can say, well, dag, I ain't trying to rock with that because the church did so-and-so, did this, that, and third. That's what happens when the salt loses its savor. Now, let me throw this at you. I'm going to throw this at you, all right? Unfortunately, a couple months ago, I live in Virginia, just down the road in Charlottesville, okay? We had that situation where we had the riots and, a man jumped in the car. I think it was a Dodge Viper or something like that and killed a woman, Now, obviously, the makers of that car did not intend for it to be used as a weapon.
Right.
Unfortunately, you had a sick individual who decided to get into that car and use it for a purpose for which it was not intended in taking somebody's life.
Right.
Now, nobody looks at that and says, daggone it, you know what? I'm not going to drive cars anymore. Nobody does that. Why? Because we recognize that this person misused something for which there were other intentions. And then on top of that, we also know that there's good reasons for us to not blame the manufacturer. Obviously, Dodge is not sitting around saying, hey, let's make cars so people can kill each other. Obviously, we know that's not the case. So we're not going to blame the manufacturer, okay? Number two, we're not gonna, like I said, we're not gonna stop driving cars because we have good reason. We need to get to work, we need to get the kids around, so on and so forth, right? Now, likewise, when it comes to Christianity, I'm not gonna blame the manufacturer. I'm not gonna blame God for the evil intentions of man, because the reality is, regardless of whatever wrongdoings have ever been done in the name of Christ, they far pale in comparison to the work of goodness and love and redemption that was accomplished by Christ himself on the cross. You see what I'm saying? So I'm not going to blame the manufacturer. And then number two, I have good reasons to affirm that Christianity is true. We have rational justifications for that, which we can get into in a minute. But there's good reasons. Think about it. Regardless of what these slave masters did, right? If it is the case that Jesus was God, died on the cross for my sins, and rose from the grave, in 33 AD, then that doesn't all of a sudden change. It just didn't happen because of what some evil-minded slave masters did 1,500 years after the fact. You see what I'm saying? The question becomes then, do I have good reasons to affirm that Christianity is true? And I would say resoundingly, absolutely. Based on historical evidence, philosophical evidence, theologically speaking, we have good grounds to say that Christianity is true.
Right. Now, you've also written some articles and you've talked a lot about Christianity during slave times. I know we already got into it a little bit, but I'd like you to go even more in depth about what that was like and give our listeners some insight as to what Christianity was like during slave times. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure, man. And this actually came out in our interview a little bit, man. I mentioned how when I was talking to David Banner, I can't remember exactly what he said, but I was talking about how these are questions that I've grappled with myself, dealing with Christianity and slavery and how Christianity fits with my African heritage, so to speak. And so, as I began to study these things for myself, I began to approach history, looking into the slave narratives, trying to get a better understanding of what the slaves experienced in their own words. I really wanted to hear from my ancestors, like what was their experience like? And I never forget, man, I was sitting down, I was reading this book called Voices from Slavery. And it's just a book, a compilation of slave narratives, slaves talking in their own words. And I came across a gentleman, I want to say it was W.L. Bost. And he was talking about how on the plantation, they would have services on Sunday and, they would kind of do their thing. But he made this comment that really struck me, right? He said that on their plantation, they would have these church services, but on the next plantation, aside from theirs, next to theirs, those slaves were not allowed to sing, pray, and so forth. And they would actually get beat for doing so. And that thing really hit me because prior to that, I kind of just had this assumption that, all slaves encountered Christianity in the same way. You kind of this idea of, a slave master with the Bible in one hand and the bullwhip in the other. That was kind of just my assumption that was the one scenario.
His butt beat during Bible study.
Right. Like this Kunta Kinte type scenario, accept Christ, boom. You know what I mean? And then it hit me that, wait a minute, there was actually a diversity of ways in which slaves encountered Christianity. It wasn't just this one type of scenario, right? And so I started looking deeper, and I started seeing these same comments among other slave narratives, like Lucretia Alexander, for example, Josiah Henson. And what I came to realize is my view of what the slaves' experience was, particularly in regard to Christianity, fell woefully short of the historical evidence and what we know about what they experienced. I hadn't done my research. And so I started digging into it, man. And what I, to your earlier point, what I came to realize is for significant portions of the slave era, there was a substantial resistance among slave masters who were actually opposing the preaching of the gospel to their slaves. Now, why is that? Now, we have to understand that going back to the colonial period here in the Americas, America was under English common law. Okay. Now, under English common law, as you said earlier, you couldn't own a Christian as a slave. Now, it was interesting, and actually, there's an author, Dr. Catherine Gerber, that mentions this in one of her works in regard to Christianity among slaves in Barbados, and she talks about how slave masters, particularly going back to the 18th century and moving forward, were hesitant about, Christianity interacting with their slaves, because again, if a slave became a Christian, then it was like, okay, well, does that mean I have to set him free now, and all this sort of a thing? And it's like, well, if I have to set him free by them being baptized, well, dag, I ain't trying to do that, because now I'm going to lose my so-called property. And then on top of that,
Right.
you have to remember that in 1491, Christianity had been introduced in the Congo. So you had some enslaved persons coming into the Western world who were already familiar with, and some professing to be Christians. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
So now you have this contradiction going on. Now let's take it a step further, okay? Because one of the justifications that Europeans appealed to for enslaving Africans was this idea that African people were less than human, or at best, maybe like adult, children. That's kind of how they view us. We were less developed. But the problem is, if you have slaves professing the same faith and are Christians just like you and able to articulate, their faith, and in some cases be able to quote scripture, so on and so forth, then that undermines this idea that these people are less than. I'm saying you start to see that this equalizer in personhood, you see? And so now you got this two-pronged problem for the slave master. On the one hand, legally speaking, there's this concern that they're going to lose their property. And on the other hand, this justification that they've been holding on to subject these slaves anyway is now being undermined. These people obviously have enough cognitive wherewithal to accept the gospel that I hold to, supposedly. You know what I'm saying? And then, so what do I do with that? And so, in the 17th, around the end of the 17th, 18th century, you start to see these legal cases coming forth, such as Felix's petition to Massachusetts court in 1773, Peter Best's in 1773. And, you have slaves petitioning to the courts on the basis of them being Christians, that, they're petitioning for their freedom. Right. So all these things kind of swirled together and basically caused slave masters to feel some kind of way. They wasn't trying to let their slaves be preached to. So we have to understand that, again, it's not just this cookie cutter idea of how slaves encountered Christianity. It's just simply not true that in all cases they were forced into it. In some cases, you have the polar opposite, to where, slave masters opposed Christianity being preached to the slaves because they understood that if somebody got a hold of the idea that there was some equality between them and the slave master on the basis of Christianity and being approved of by God, that, the slave master would say things like it'll make the slave uppity, or they'll get out of control, and so on and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, they were right. They were absolutely right. Because if you think about the most successful slave revolt in human history, maybe, I guess, other than Spartacus, I have to do the research on that, but certainly during the transatlantic slave era, the most successful slave revolt was waged by Toussaint Louverture, who was a devout Catholic. He was a devout Catholic. You can do the research for yourself. You know what I'm saying? He was devout, and I'm not talking about, Catholic where they mixing it with like, voodoo and so forth. Do the research. He was a devout Catholic and actually had outlawed voodoo when Haiti was established as its own nation. So I mean, this idea that Christianity was just this monolithic experience for everybody just simply isn't true. We have to value
That's where
the
we
fact.
get off. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
We have to value the fact that it was to the slave to know that you were claimed by God was a personhood equalizer. They actually used the conversion experience and took it to be a form of personal resistance. I'm gonna leave you with this. I would encourage everybody to read the autobiography of Josiah Henson. Right, a lot of people are familiar with Uncle Tom. And obviously we use that term, derisively, but originally it wasn't meant to be that way. And the character Uncle Tom was based on a real person named Josiah Henson. Now, just to tell a quick story, he had escaped from slavery. He ended up being a public speaker. He moved to Canada, traveled abroad, lived in England for a while. I mean, he really, made a name for himself to the point where he was able, actually, had the audience with presidents and so forth, be able to speak to them about, his experiences. And he talks about how later on in life, he wanted to take his wife back to the plantation where he grew up. And so, fast forward and they go to the plantation. It's overgrown, just really shabby, and just, totally not how he remembered it. This is after the Civil War, of course. And he goes in to see, the slave master, his ex-slave master, who at that time was deceased. However, the wife of the slave master was still there. She was sickly. She was bedridden, so forth. So he goes in to see her, and initially she doesn't recognize him. but he had particular scars on his arms. And so in order for her to recognize him, he allows her to feel alarm. And then she recognizes that, oh, it's Josiah Henson. She referred to him as Cy. And so what's interesting is when she recognizes who he is, she says, Cy, it's you. I'm sorry to tell you, but your master is dead and gone. And in response to her, he says, no, madam, my master is yet alive. And he's talking about Jesus Christ. You see what I'm saying? That's what the conversion experience meant to the slave. We got to stop degrading our African enslaved ancestors by making them out to be these mindless dupes who didn't have enough sense to tell truth from falsehood. Okay. It basically by saying, hey, this is, my master is yet alive. Again, this is a form of personal resistance. It's this idea that given that I belong to God, the master of all, to the slave master, you might have my body, but you can't have my soul. See what I'm saying? That's what the conversion experience was a statement of. And we have to stop, like I said, degrading our African ancestors. I mean, this thing, when it comes to, the abolition of slavery, there's no question that Christians were essential to the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement began in the church. It began in the church. We could talk about, Olaudah Equiano. We could talk about William Wilberforce, William Lloyd Garrison, Henry Highland Garnett, Frederick Douglass. We could talk about Martin Delaney. We can talk about all sorts of folks. I can go on and on. Jermaine Le Guin. You know what I'm saying? Reverend Jermaine Le Guin, excuse me. These Christians, you know what I'm saying, who were so pivotal to the advancement of African Americans and getting out of slavery on through the Civil War.
Brown, huh?
Oh yeah,
I see you don't never mention John.
I don't know why
you
right.
like John Brown. You don't mention John
they
Brown.
Cool. You're right.
You think
my
you
bad.
crazy, right?
I left him out, man. My fault.
That was Frederick's boy, though.
That was
They
Frederick's boy.
together.
You're right.
Yeah.
I missed him, but it's the whole point is, it's simply not true. Now here's the thing. I'm gonna wrap it up with this. In terms of this aspect here. When you think about the old hymns, the hymns that kind of come out of that era, you know what I'm saying? You don't hear slaves singing about God as this oppressor God. You never do, right? You always hear them singing about a God of liberty, a God who either in this life or the next will set them free. So to whatever extent the slave master intended for slaves to adopt this idea that they have to remain subject and that God was on the side of the slave master, obviously that idea didn't take, because when you think about how these songs and sayings among slaves, it was like that was expression of their culture and their collective ideas.
It's a battle cry.
I'm saying it was a battle cry. As a matter of fact, during the Civil War, and you can actually check this out, there's a brother named Lawrence Levine who's written an article on this, and where he mentions how during the Civil War, you start to see slave songs, talking about how God was with the North. And it was acting through the North to vanquish their Southern oppressors. You see what I'm saying? The slaves understood that God was a God of liberty. I'm saying there wasn't just this monolithic experience where they were just beat like Kunta Kinte into Christianity. That's simply not the full breadth of what you see in the historical records. Now, here's the thing. If all we knew about that era in terms of Christianity and slavery was that, we just got beat into Christianity, that was it. If that's all we had to go on, then it would be understandable why people would feel some kind of way about Christianity. But the problem is once you start doing your own research and you let history speak for itself, you let the ancestors speak for themselves, then all of a sudden you have this broader picture of historical data from which you can draw your conclusions about Christianity. I don't have to decide my stance towards Christianity based on the slave master alone. I can look at my ancestors and see how they would rush off into hush harbors at the dark of night, you know what I'm saying, at the risk of being beaten by the slave masters to practice Christianity independent of and counter to the slave masters' Christianity. I can look at how, purported Christianity. I could look at how, the slaves took Christianity to be this personal resistance, how abolitionism began in the church. I can join with my ancestors and stand with them in their faith, and then live out the life and faith that surely they prayed for me to live out. So, to me, I think when you condense Christianity down to the white man's religion and you just write it off based upon some, the white picture of Jesus or, just one era of history, then you do a tremendous disservice to history. You do a tremendous disservice to our ancestors who of their own volition, took on Christianity because they saw through the hypocrisy of the slave master's religion, and even in those circumstances transcended above it.
Good stuff, bro.
Yeah.
Good stuff, man. I know you could go in on this all day. This is your
Yeah,
wheelhouse.
man, that's what I do, bro.
But man, he raised so many points. I want us to keep going through, keep hitting at some of this stuff because I know you got a lot more to say as well. So
Sure.
that was wonderful, man. Thank you for the history lesson. Thank you for the bars. Yeah, so one of the things, one of the next topics that David Banner brought up, which was a topic that we actually really, one of the main reasons we brought him on to discuss was hip hop music. And he talked about how he felt hip hop had become a tool, one of the main tools in the hand of white supremacy because of a lot of the caricatures and stereotypes that are being perpetuated through the music. He felt that it's something that has been able to be a primary tool in justifying a lot of the unarmed killings of black men that we see and mass incarceration and things of that nature. So let's play a clip of that right now so you guys can hear what he said. And then I want to hear your thoughts on the other end of that.
So again, I've been conscious all the time. I was just drunk, high, and other things. And what happened was when I had my hit song, Get Like Me with Chris Brown, I got a chance to travel internationally. And I saw how America was broadcasting black men all around the world. And that was during the time when reality TV shows had just started. So what I think, and this is my concept, that was also during the time when they started pushing to militarize our local police forces. So what happens is they broadcast black people as being savages all around the world. And what's crazy is I honestly believe this, and I don't say this on too many shows, but since this is a black show, I'll say it, that hip-hop has almost become the right hand of white supremacy, because when they say that we are, those words that they use to describe us, and most of the hip-hop that comes out now, and I am talking about myself at the time, I'm not talking about any other rapper, we're falling right into the stereotypes and the stigmatisms that they're putting out about black people all around the world.
Heavy stuff. So,
Yeah, man. Yeah.
So talk to me about that, man. Where do you think it was on? Where do you think it was off? How you feel about it?
Okay. Like I said earlier, I'm always looking for ways that I can find common ground, with people who maybe on some things I disagree with. And this is one of those points where I really respected kind of how David Banner came at it in terms of taking personal responsibility. And I think there's actually a lot of hands in the pot in terms of why hip hop is so destructive. I don't think that it all falls on, the rapper. But at the same time, I do respect the fact that he was willing to say, hey, we got to do better. Like, if we out there putting garbage out, then then we need to stop. You say we need to put out better messages. And actually, I respected the fact that he put some of the onus on the listeners as well as the fans. He's like, look, he mentioned how with Oprah, she talked the game. I'm not dissing Oprah. Hopefully we can have. I'm not trying to keep it so where we can't have her on the show one day, but he mentioned goals, yeah, podcast goals,
right?
He mentioned how she was dogging out hip hop, but at the same time, like, as he said, shaking her butt to 50 Cent at her birthday party. Mm-hmm. He was joking around, but I took his point that if you want music that uplifts the community and builds people, then you got to support it. Mm-hmm. And to whatever degree that the fans don't support it, then it's not going to do well, and you're not going to see it on the market.
Well, he did own it as well, though. He did own it because he said some of conscious music just sucks, is what he said. So he owned it on both sides, the music, the artist, and the listener.
He did.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, keep going.
No, that was really the long and short of it, man. Like I said, it was good to find common ground on the subject, and I think that that's helpful. When you can find common ground with somebody, then it's helpful to work when you want to work through other difficult issues.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So like you said, talk about winning a friend and kind of working from there. So
yeah, I
really enjoyed that part of the interview. What were your thoughts on it, man? I kind of want to get your perspective.
Yeah. No, obviously I enjoyed it, and I've been pretty vocal on the other table talks that I get pretty irritated with this with hip hop being used as a scapegoat for a lot of the ills, social ills and spiritual ills, I would say, that we see in the African American community, particularly for the main reason that a lot of those issues, whatever markers you want to look at, whether it be homicides, overall crime, infant mortality, mass incarceration, a lot of these issues predate the creation or the uptick that we see in hip hop music. You know, like I said before, we was dancing to the Four Tops. You know, we were having a lot of issues. My
Right.
dad will always say, you know, and I won't use the his full language, but you know, he says like, look, man, this stuff was going on when I was a kid. You know, he said black folks just didn't have guns. You know, but
Mm.
they had box cutters and knives. You know, and they be cutting each other and stuff like that. You know, and so, but
I really hope your dad hears this podcast, but he can hear that impersonation, brother.
yeah. No, my dad cuts up, man. You don't want to hear. You know, I'm not gonna put my dad's stuff out there like that. But
You use the edited
uh,
version,
yeah,
the
exactly.
King Talks podcast
But he be
version.
talking facts. Look, I mean, so
Okay.
um, but I will say, that being said, the conversation when we talk about hip hop music, we cannot negate the fact that overall, um, eh, specifically when you talk about certain kinds of music, that it has a negative impact overall on our community. That just cannot be thrown away, especially when you look at how mainstream hip hop culture is. And when you look at the fatherless problems in the black community and how we are more vulnerable to identifying with certain figures or pop culture icons, and we are more vulnerable to the images that we see in the music, unlike, you know, Billy or even your standard middle class black kid who lives in a two-parent home in the suburbs. You know, he too might not be as vulnerable, but we know that's not the.
No disrespect to Billy, right?
Yeah, no disrespect to Billy or even Duran, who's doing well. You know what I'm
Okay,
saying?
gotcha. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm
Like
with you.
myself, I grew up in a middle class, you know, majority black neighborhood, and most of us did not. We love hip hop, we love the culture, but we didn't fall ill to a lot of the stereotypes just because a lot of my friends, we did have fathers in the home. And so that was somewhat of a safety blanket, not entirely, but it was. But I will say, when you look at historically, and you look at things like the blackface movement or the
Hmm.
minstrel movement, you see, I see a lot of parallels, and this is, I'm not the first one to say this. This has been a, you know, a lot of people have talked about this. And for those who don't know, the minstrel shows were a form of American entertainment that developed in the early 19th century. And it was basically skits and plays and dancing and all that kind of stuff, that was performed by white folks. You had white people painting their faces black
Hmm.
and portraying themselves, really portraying a story to the American people about what it meant to be a slave on the plantation. And most
Hmm.
and slaves were portrayed as happy-go-lucky, dumb, intelligent people who enjoyed slavery, who were satisfied on the plantation, but were also too dumb and too unintelligent to be trusted with freedom, right? And
Mm.
so they perpetuated very negative stereotypes about black people. And some would say some of the same things are done today through hip hop music. Uh, Only whites could be in minstrel shows. It wasn't
Hmm.
until after abolition or right up until abolition that you start to see black troops forming. Now, after abolition, your most popular troops or groups of troops, just meaning groups of entertainers who perform minstrel shows, were black. Now,
Hmm.
around in the mid 19th century, minstrel shows had become the most popular form of entertainment in the country. So by the time black people could perform minstrel shows and do it better than their white counterparts, here you have this sort of dichotomy taking place because blacks are getting access to show their talents and their skill sets in the most popular form of entertainment in the country. So it's a means of legitimizing themselves. It's a means of becoming to restoring some sense of personal dignity, and also being a part of the mainstream culture, right? And so, as much as it was a form of progress, it was also they were also required to affirm these same stereotypes that their white counterparts were affirming for the first part of the 19th century. They still had to act happy and dance. They still had to portray themselves as happy slaves on the plantation. Um, this kind of entertainment that Black people started participating in was simultaneously restoring their personhood, or giving them some form of increased legitimacy, and simultaneously demeaning themselves and undermining themselves. And so Frederick Douglass talked about this. He talked about the sort of the catch-22 that the minstrel shows presented. It was an opportunity to move forward while simultaneously undermining Black people at the same time by affirming the stereotypes. And keep in mind, these troops were owned by whites, right? Some of the same stuff we see today. You have big corporations who own these record companies, and the reality is that, these negative stereotypes, this curiosity that people have about African American culture, the worst parts of our culture is what sells many times. And so that's part of what David Banner was even talking about himself. Like, I got on from like a pimp. That's what put me on. It's not the work that I did with Crooked Letters. It was when I started coming out and affirming all these negative stereotypes about Black people that everything took off. And so, and not to mention, Black people also made a large part of the audiences when it came to minstrel shows. So just like back then, when Blacks showed up and supported this negative, racist portrayal of their own people, even today, we support some of the same music that undermines us, because there's a certain pride we get in just being popular and being adored and um, being recognized in the mainstream. And so, again, that catch-22 is something that Douglas talked about himself. He hated the minstrel shows, but at the same time recognized it was an opportunity for progress for African Americans. He empathized with that. And so it's a very interesting thing that you have to look at. And so you fast forward to today, where hip hop gives Black people the opportunity to show themselves in such a dynamic light, right? It gives us the opportunity to show our skills, our wordplay, our ability to dance, and all these beautiful things that the music brings. But the question is, are we telling our story, or are we telling someone else's, right? And are we repeating the same legacy of the minstrel shows, our oppressors? Are we telling the story that actually moves us forward as a culture? Because that's what hip hop was when it first started, right? It was the story of the KRS-Ones of the world. You know what I'm saying? And not to say that, that we're saints, and if hip, I'm saying, of course, hip hop would still be diverse, but is it our story, or is it the story of corporate CEOs and, big money? And the sign that it's the story of big money is when the worst kind of stereotypes are the ones that are being put forward the most. That's the sign.
Facts.
You know what I'm saying? That's the sign. That's what the minstrel shows were. And that's what has happened to our music, where the worst kind of parts of our culture are the ones that are being flushed in front of your face. It's not that they don't exist, but they're the worst kind. It's the worst type of stereotype that you give. It's the lowest part of our culture, and that's what you put forward. You know what I'm saying? And that's the sign that big money, and I would say that you are teaching your oppressor's message, no matter whatever culture you may be, because you're undermining yourself as a person. And so I would say, from that standpoint, man, hip hop needs more David Banners. They need more people who will call sound the alarm on what's happening in our music. We need
Yeah.
more people that are telling our story, whether it be a Kendrick Lamar or a Chance the Rapper, that will tell it in a different way. Obviously as a Christian, I believe there's great art coming out of the Christian hip hop genre. The Lecrae's of the world and the KBs and Andy Mineos and people of that sort. So, and shout out to our own Reflect, King Anthem coming out, an album that's going to be coming out in the new year, which is going to be power packed with some great stuff. So, yeah, man, those are my thoughts on that. And I don't know, if you ain't got nothing else, man, we'll get into the next thing.
Yeah, man. I mean, I respect everything you said. I agree, man. Like I said, it was one of the parts of the interview that I really appreciated. Now, you mentioned just real quick, real briefly, you mentioned Lecrae, and this is probably going to get me in trouble with some of my listeners. But I just want to throw this out here. I mean, kind of put it in context of what you were saying about the minstrel shows and whatnot. I know my wife and I, we enjoy watching old movies from African Americans. I'm talking about going back to like the 1940s, maybe 50s or something like that. And one thing I noticed that both of us took note of is that in some of those old black and white movies, you know what I'm saying, where it's just an all African American cast, what's interesting is the characters that are presented as being beautiful or important are often light skinned, which is very interesting. I'm saying very interesting. And I think that it's almost an expression of this internalized oppression coming through, even though the movie itself is an all black cast, all black producers, so on and so forth. Now, I said that to say, bringing it back around to Lecrae, and I think this is to your point, that even when we're able to have the opportunity to tell our own story, I think that it does, there's something to be said about being able to tell that story from a redeemed perspective, or from a healthy perspective. I'll just put it that way, take kind of the theological language out of it, from a healthy perspective. And I think that that's something that Lecrae would be able to do that maybe some of these other artists couldn't. You know what I'm saying? When you have somebody who is, whatever people want to say about him, he professes Christ, and he claims to hold to a biblical worldview. That's what he says about himself. And so I can't call him a liar. I don't know the guy. But, somebody who professes to know Christ, you know what I'm saying, and is making an effort to bring that biblical worldview into their music, I think can be countercultural in ways that maybe a David Banner couldn't, So just something to think about.
Okay. No, that's good. I'm not going to argue with that.
And of course, as always, to the King Talks family out there, definitely want to say thank you for listening. And actually want to give a special shout out. I want to say I appreciate all those who reached out and just shared how they're appreciative of what we're doing here with the King Talks podcast. Thanks for the prayers and the feedback. And of course, if you haven't done so already, definitely slide over to iTunes where you can subscribe to the King Talks podcast. We're available on SoundCloud as well. Make sure you leave a comment, give us 5 stars, and let other people know what we're doing here at the King Talks podcast. Of course, if you're interested in the King movement itself, you can definitely go to kingmovement.com, where you can even join our online community with no commitment and at no cost to you. As always, strong in the Lord.
Yeah. I brought the Kings with me on this one. It's a movement. Yeah. I had a dream. I saw black slaves in 2017, pulling the big king with a crown in the middle, looking like tug of war. I guess they forgot the inheritance of the Lord, dying over streets when God gave him the earth. It's all in the Bible, just do your research. White man's religion, that's just fake news. The cross hit Africa for Europe even knew. This ain't black versus white, this is dark versus light. But racism might distract you from the Christ on sight.